Part 1. You will hear a woman phoning to ask about a summer cycling camp for her young son, who is called Charlie. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Hello, Junior Cycle Camp. Jake speaking.
Hi, I'm calling for some information about the cycle camp. I'm thinking of sending my son.
Great. Well, it's held every weekday morning over the summer vacation, and we focus on basic cycling skills and safety. We have 8 levels for children from 3 years upwards. How old's your son?
Charlie, he's 7. He can ride a bike, but he needs a little more training before he's safe to go on the road.
He'd probably be best in level 5. They start off practicing on the site here, and we aim to get them riding on the road. But first, they're taken to ride in the park, away from the traffic.
Right. And can you tell me a bit about the instructors?
Well, all our staff wear different colored shirts. So we have 3 supervisors, and they have red shirts. They support the instructors, and they also stand in for me if I'm not around. Then the instructors themselves are in blue shirts, and one of these is responsible for each class.
Okay.
In order to be accepted, all our instructors have to submit a reference from someone who's seen them work with children. Like if they've worked as a babysitter, for example. Then they have to complete our training course, including how to do lesson plans and generally care for the well-being of the kids in their class. They do a great job, I have to say.
Right. And tell me a bit about the classes. What size will Charlie's class be?
We have a limit of 8 children in each class, so their instructor really gets to know them well. They're out riding most of the time, but they have quiet times too, where their instructor might tell them a story that's got something to do with cycling, or get them to play a game together. It's a lot of fun.
It must be. Now, what happens if there's rain? Do the classes still run?
Oh, yes. We don't let that put us off. We just put on our waterproofs and keep cycling.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
And is there anything special Charlie should bring along with him?
Well, maybe some spare clothes, especially if the weather's not so good. And a snack for break time?
How about a drink?
No, we'll provide that. And make sure he has shoes, not sandals.
Sure. And just at present, Charlie has to take medication every few hours, so I'll make sure he has that.
Absolutely. Just give us details of when he has to take it, and we'll make sure he does.
Thanks.
Now, there are a few things you should know about day 1 of the camp. The classes normally start at 9:30 every morning, but on day 1, you should aim to get Charlie here by 9:20. The finishing time will be 12:30 as usual. We need the additional time because there are a few extra things to do. The most important is that we have a very careful check to make sure that every child's helmet fits properly. If it doesn't fit, we'll try to adjust it, or we'll find him another one. But he must wear it all the time he's on the bike.
Of course.
Then, after that, all the instructors will be waiting to meet their classes, and they'll meet up in the tent. You can't miss it, and each instructor will take their class away and get started.
Okay, well, that all sounds good. Now, can you tell me how much the camp costs a week?
$199. We've managed to keep the price more or less the same as last year. It was $190 then. But the places are filling up quite quickly.
Right. Okay, well, I'd like to book for the...
Part 4. You will hear a lecturer on a fashion design course introducing the subject of hand knitting, which involves making things like woolen jumpers and scarves. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to look at an important creative activity, and that's hand knitting. Ancient knitted garments have been found in many different countries, showing that knitting is a global activity with a long history. When someone says the word knitting, we might well picture an elderly person, a grandmother perhaps, sitting by the fire knitting garments for themselves or other members of the family. It's a homely image, but one that may lead you to feel that knitting is an activity of the past. And indeed, during the previous decade, it was one of the skills that was predicted to vanish from everyday life. For although humans have sewn and knitted their own clothing for a very long time, many of these craft-based skills went into decline when industrial machines took over, mainly because they were no longer passed down from one generation to another. However, that's all changing, and interest in knitting classes in many countries is actually rising, as more and more people are seeking formal instruction in the skill. With that trend, we're also seeing an increase in the sales figures for knitting equipment. So, why do people want to be taught to knit at a time when a machine can readily do the job for them? The answer is that knitting, as a handicraft, has numerous benefits for those doing it. Let's consider what some of these might be. While many people knitted garments in the past because they couldn't afford to buy clothes, it's still true today that knitting can be helpful if you're experiencing economic hardship. If you have several children who all need warm winter clothes, knitting may save you a lot of money. And the results of knitting your own clothes can be very rewarding, even though the skills you need to get going are really quite basic, and the financial outlay is minimal. But the more significant benefits in today's world are to do with well-being. In a world where it's estimated that we spend up to 9 hours a day online, doing something with our hands that is craft-based makes us feel good. It releases us from the stress of a technological, fast-paced life. Now, let's look back a bit to early knitting activities. In fact, no one really knows when knitting first began, but archaeological remains have disclosed plenty of information for us to think about. One of the interesting things about knitting is that the earliest pieces of clothing that have been found suggest that most of the items produced were round rather than flat. Discoveries from the 3rd and 4th centuries in Egypt show that things like socks and gloves that were needed to keep hands and feet warm were knitted in one piece using 4 or 5 needles. That's very different from most knitting patterns today, which only require 2. What's more, the very first needles people used were hand-carved out of wood and other natural materials, like bone, whereas today's needles are largely made of steel or plastic and make that characteristic clicking sound when someone's using them. Ancient people knitted using yarns made from linen, hemp, cotton and wool, and these were often very rough on the skin. The spinning wheel, which allowed people to make finer yarns and produce much greater quantities of them, led to the dominance of wool in the knitting industry, often favoured for its warmth. Another interesting fact about knitting is that because it was practised in so many parts of the world, for so many purposes, regional differences in style developed. This visual identity has allowed researchers to match bits of knitted clothing that have been unearthed over time to the region from which the wearer came, or the job that he or she did. As I've mentioned, knitting offered people from poor communities a way of making extra money while doing other tasks. For many centuries, it seems, men, women, and children took every opportunity to knit, for example, while watching over sheep, walking to market, or riding in boats. So, let's move on to take...
That is the end